The topic of dual running is not that easy to cover. So please bear with me for a few minutes whilst I'm describing the practical approaches to dual running. It's not that easy. But in the end of this, I hope you'll learn a few tricks and things. So what is dual running? Look at this diagram on the screen. The top one is your old infrastructure. And at the bottom is your new infrastructure. Dual running is essentially the time when you migrated. You're migrating from the old infrastructure. It's apparent that it always takes time. I've seen instances when applications were migrated from an old infrastructure to a new infrastructure for, say, 2 years. I've seen cases when a team of highly professional, well-prepared people was able to migrate applications in less than 3 months. I've seen that too. What happens during this period of migration? Essentially, you consume 2 sets of licenses. How do you manage that? The answer to the question, does Microsoft provide dual running rights to use your license simultaneously in the old and the new infrastructure? Depends on whether you're migrating on-premise or to the cloud. If you're migrating on-premise, you're effectively required to buy additional licenses for the new infrastructure. With Azure, you're given a period of 180 days to migrate your licenses to Azure, to use them at the same time in your data center and in Azure only through the right that is called Azure Hybrid Benefit, which only applies to Windows Server and SQL Server, and only when you have active software assurance. This is the only explicitly granted dual use right in Microsoft licensing. If you're migrating any other Microsoft software to Azure, there is no dual use right. What are your options? What can you do about the missing right to dual run licenses on premises? First thing, which won't apply to the whole period. So let's say this is your entire migration period. In the first few weeks or months when you're testing the solution, you could use MSDN non-production licenses to build and test your solution whilst it's not yet even in staging. Your end users are not working with it, you're not migrating production data, you're not connecting to production data, it's your test period. You can claim it's a test. What are the pitfalls in this solution? Every user, every admin, every backup operator, every IT security person who will have access to this newly built infrastructure will have to be licensed with some sort of Visual Studio subscription, MSDN platform subscription, some sort of MSDN subscription to be eligible to access those products. It's not just developers that need those licenses. Every person who has access to this must be licensed with some flavor of MSDN. And it only applies for the first month. So you will need a good benchmarking. You need to compare various options and see what's cheaper for you to use your production licenses or use MSDN licenses. You can't use MSDN license for the whole period of dual running in your infrastructure. So therefore, you need to figure out the least expensive way to use production licenses during dual running. So your first option is CSP. You can subscribe for licenses just for this period. And I think this is the most economical way. You just buy monthly licenses if you can. Where you cannot buy monthly subscriptions, well, you have to default to annual subscriptions through EA, through CSP. Now the question is, can you avoid it entirely by somehow circumventing Microsoft's rules of licensing? The first thing that comes to mind, and I've heard it from many people, is just common sense. We'll just tell Microsoft, we're migrating, and they will let us use licenses in a dual running scenario. There's no incentive for Microsoft to allow you doing that. They want you to migrate to Azure. If you want to migrate to Azure, use Azure Hybrid Benefits, migrate to Azure, you have dual running rights for Windows Server and SQL Server. There you go. Can it be somehow granted personally by Microsoft's team you're working with? If you have good relationship with technical account managers, if you have good relationships with your account managers, you can ask Microsoft for an excuse. And Microsoft perhaps, might, could allow you that. And in all the cases when my customers went to Microsoft and asked for an excuse, they were granted that excuse. But please bear in mind, that excuse is a personal excuse from the teams that manage your account. Even if it's granted in an email, you can potentially use that. I had a customer who had an audit during migration, and they managed to show that email from Microsoft to the auditor. Therefore, the auditors didn't count the new infrastructure in the licensing requirements. At that particular point in time, that particular auditor was convinced by that email from Microsoft, okay, fine, we can discount it for now. It has no legal power, but you can ask for that excuse. Go to Microsoft, tell them we're going to be migrating, give them exact time frame, and try to perform this migration during that time frame. Through an enterprise agreement, you get true-up rights. There's a misconception that if you do that migration during the year, you will then be able to declare what you're using by the end of the true-up period, because we have to report once a year. We'll only tell Microsoft the numbers by the end of the year. That is against the licensing rules. And if Microsoft come to you with an audit, and if they check your licensing, and if you have a conversation with them, and they ask you, what was your high watermark? What was your peak usage during the year? You had to license that peak usage. This is your 1 year of an enterprise agreement. And your migration happened somewhere here. You had spike of licensing needs. You have to true up this number, even though you're not going to be using that surplus of licenses in the next year. I think CSP, or if you have an enterprise agreement subscription, those are your only options. And if you don't want to pay that, you have to go to Microsoft and ask for an excuse. Please bear in mind, if you tell them you're going to migrate in 3 months and you then do that in 6 months, that's going to be used against you in any discount negotiations. Please be true to your word. That is the advice.